Hello, today we're going to talk about utilitarianism. This first slideshow is just going to walk you through some of the basic elements of the theory. It's going to be followed by another separate slideshow that will look at some of the major criticisms of the theory and also look at a modern formulation of it. And then you have a third really short one that walks you through how you would go about applying utilitarianism to a case. So with utilitarianism, we need to first define these basic ethical concepts of the good and the right. So remember, the good is whatever we're striving for, and under utilitarianism, that is defined as happiness or pleasure. Mill uses these terms interchangeably, but he really wants to promote the notion of happiness over pleasure. And then the right will be however we achieve the good. So on the face of it, utilitarianism may look a little similar to egoism because it looks like we're supposed to do what makes us happy. However, with utilitarianism, we're supposed to look beyond our own happiness and consider the happiness of others as well. So this is not a selfish theory. It's a theory that requires us in actuality to think about the happiness of others. So when we think about moral decisions, they have certain elements to them. First is the moral agent. This is the person who's making the ethical decision, and he is someone or she is someone that has the qualities of being rational and being autonomous. A rational person is just someone who's able to think logically and understands what they're doing. And an autonomous person is someone who behaves freely and who is able to make their own decisions and act freely. We have the act itself, and then we have the consequences. So different moral theories are going to kind of zero in on different parts of this framework for moral decision making, and utilitarianism is going to focus on consequences. So it is a consequence-based theory, sometimes called consequentialism. And that just means that it's a theory that's concerned with consequences is what determines morality. So happiness and pleasure is our main focus here. It is the one thing that is desired by everyone for its own sake. We already said that that constitutes the good. And everything else that we think we want is really only of instrumental value. It's something that we use as a tool to get happiness. So there's nothing else that has this intrinsic worth of the good, only happiness, and even things that are not tangible, like having a good character, we only want because having those good character traits, let's say, would make us happy. Same thing with money or a good reputation or any of a number of things. So there are three main tenets of utilitarianism. The first is that actions are judged right or wrong based on their consequences. So we already talked about that as a consequentialist theory. And we already said that the desired consequence is happiness, or if you cannot achieve maximum happiness, you're trying to minimize unhappiness to the greatest extent that you can. And finally, and I have this in bold because it's a very important point, everyone's happiness counts equally or is of equal value. So what that means is if happiness is the thing that we all desire for its own sake, we all desire it the same amount. Nobody wants happiness more than any other person wants happiness. Because of that, there's no reason for me to privilege my happiness over other people's. There's no reason for me to privilege the happiness of people I happen to know over the happiness of people that I don't happen to know. There's also no reason for me to privilege the happiness of my friends and family over the happiness of strangers or of people in my country versus people who live in other countries. So this is a really egalitarian theory. It requires us to treat everyone's happiness exactly the same in value. Now, this is different people might experience different types of happiness as a result of a certain action, but we have to take the fact that they want happiness as equally valid. So this is going to lead to the greatest happiness principle, in which Mill says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong when they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So what we're going to get at here is that we're trying to achieve the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number. So we have these basic assumptions of utilitarianism, that happiness is the good and that the consequences of our actions are in fact predictable. Because we can predict them, we can be held responsible for them. So this theory really rejects the idea that you never know what will happen. The idea is, at least most of the time, we can reasonably predict the consequences of our actions. And we can do that based on our own past experience. I know the last time I didn't study for this test, I failed it. I should probably study for the next test. Other people's experience, my friend got a speeding ticket on this road the other day, I'd better slow down. Or just by gathering evidence, kind of like in science, by doing tests and gathering data. So because we have all these sources of knowledge, it is reasonable to say that we most of the time know what the consequences of our actions are likely to be. So here's a new vocab term that we'll be applying not just to utilitarianism, but to other cases as well, or other theories as well. And that is the idea of the moral community. The moral community is just the group of individuals whose interests have to be taken into account when making ethical decisions. So every philosopher or philosophical theory is going to have a slightly different take on what makes someone qualified to be in the moral community or out of the moral community. So this is a definition that changes depending on which theory that we're talking about, who's in and who's out of the moral community. But anytime you're making a moral decision, the first thing you probably need to think about is who's involved and do I need to take that person or that individual's interest into account? So with utilitarianism, the moral community is construed very broadly. It's a big moral community because it's comprised of all sentient beings. Any individual capable of experiencing pleasure and pain has what we call sentience. So even though there are human beings who are clearly capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, there are also a lot of non-human animals who would fall into this category as well. And if we are making a decision that would affect any individual, human or non-human, who might experience pleasure or pain as a result of our actions, we have to take that into account when we're making a moral decision. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be treating animals the same exact way we treat people, because people are capable of more sophisticated pleasures and pains than animals are. So Jeremy Bentham, who's pictured here, is the father of utilitarianism. He's not the philosopher you read for today. He was actually the tutor of John Stuart Mill, who's the philosopher that you read for today. Bentham is the founder of this theory, and he really wanted to promote it as a way to make good policy and law decisions. So he was a British philosopher, and he taught John Stuart Mill in philosophy and other topics in the law, and he was friends with John Stuart Mill's father. So this picture here is Jeremy Bentham's preserved body, which is on display at the University College of London in England. And he dictated that his body be preserved this way and kept there in his will. He helped found the college, and I guess he wasn't the most modest of human beings. So just to answer the question that you probably all have after you've looked at this picture for a minute, that down there at the bottom is his actual head. But as you can see, it was starting to look a little strange. So they created a wax replica of Bentham's head, which is what you see actually sitting on his shoulders. So Bentham, other than being a really kind of interesting guy, promoted the idea of pleasure as the most important, as the good, as the thing that we're all trying to achieve. And that really led to a lot of pushback. So when his student John Stuart Mill took the mantle of promoting the theory of utilitarianism, one of the first things Mill did was to change the language of pleasure, which sounds very sensual, to the language of happiness, which sounds a little more socially acceptable. So Mill wanted to defend this theory of utilitarianism against its main critics and to promote it as not just a good way of making law and policy, but a good way of personal decision-making as well. The main objection that Mill was trying to respond to in the excerpt that you have was this notion that utilitarianism is, quote, a doctrine worthy of swine. The reason people said that was because with Bentham's emphasis on pleasure, it kind of sounded to people like he was reducing human beings to these pleasure machines, and they were no different from animals. So this is one thing that Mill really felt like he needed to respond to in order to promote the theory. He did that by distinguishing between types of pleasures. He says, yeah, there are all these lower pleasures, these physical pleasures that we do share with animals, but there are also these special, more intellectual, higher pleasures, and those are the ones we really need to focus on. So the lower pleasures are these ones that are shared with animals, and they're mostly physical. So eating a delicious meal, getting a good night's sleep, and of course sexual pleasure would all fall into this category of pleasures that both human beings and other animals can experience and enjoy. These are usually short-lived. What I mean by that is the pleasure that you get from these experiences doesn't stay with you for a long time and doesn't help perpetuate similar pleasures in the future. It's an isolated incident, and once that pleasurable experience is over, the effects kind of fade away. So these are often things that we can and do sacrifice to achieve higher pleasures. So you might, for example, give up on sleep in order to do well in a class and gain that knowledge. These usually benefit just the individual. So if I eat a delicious meal or I get a good night's sleep, I'm the only one who's directly benefiting from that. There might be some minor secondary benefits. Maybe I'm less cranky to be around if I've gotten a good night's sleep. But really, I'm the primary beneficiary of that, and that benefit, as we said, doesn't last very long. The next day, I still need to get another good night's sleep to continue the cycle. So higher pleasures are a little bit different. These, by and large, are unique to human beings, and these are intellectual pleasures. So things like reading a good book, enjoying a movie, listening to a piece of music, gaining knowledge by taking a class, right? These are all things that, as far as we know, only human beings can really appreciate. And only human beings have a certain intellectual ability, really. So these have long-lasting positive benefits. So those of you who are teachers perhaps might know about this. If you learned something in a past class that you're now able to use and apply to your students in your current job, you're happier because you're doing a better job. You're positively benefiting your students and their parents and the broader community. And so there are a lot of long-lasting positive benefits to obtaining these higher pleasures. So hopefully we've all had the experience of learning something or doing something intellectual, and the satisfaction from that and the knowledge that you got from that stays with you in a positive way for a long time. These often, as I said, require us to sacrifice the lower pleasures for the higher, and the higher pleasures are more likely to benefit society. In other words, a lot of other people are going to benefit if we have a society where we cultivate these intellectual talents. Sometimes, though, they can make the individual unhappy. So sometimes the more you know, the less satisfied you happen to be. Sometimes you learn things you wish you didn't know. Sometimes you have to sacrifice so many lower pleasures in pursuit of the higher that makes you unhappy. But because we've got a theory that's focused on maximizing everyone's happiness, sometimes that individual sacrifice will have to be made for the greater good. So Mill says, famously on page 116 of your text, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they only know their side of the question. What Mill's getting at here is he's totally rejecting the idea that ignorance is bliss. He says ignorance is most certainly not bliss. You may feel good if you're the ignorant person, right? The pig or the fool feel satisfied because they don't know any better. But the human being compared to the pig, or Socrates compared to the fool, they know they've got the better deal. And no human being, he says, would consent to be turned into an animal in order to live that life of blissful ignorance. We know that we would have to give too much up. Okay, so that's the end of what we're doing for today. What you want to do next is move on to the second video that will talk about some of the problems with the theory and some of the modern formulations.